Testing.
Do y'all prefer to pass the mic, or do you want everybody to the mic?
I have a mic.
Yeah, I have one.
This mic here. I mean,
Okay.
grab the mic or something.
Yeah,
Excellent.
just so y'all have to worry about that.
And then if anybody,
I'm a good thing.
so I know we don't have a big crowd, but those of us who are here, if we could just go ahead and engage in that traditional call and response real quick. Good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate you. To those who are here, thank you very much. Those joining us virtually, those who will see this later, we're not set, it's not on.
You open it, and then tap the switch. Make sure it's on.
Is this working? All right, there we go. So if we're virtual, I mute myself, and if we're live, I mute myself still, right? Is that what we're saying? All right, anyway, once again, greetings, everybody. Welcome to our Trans-Africa Bill of Rights Convocation here at Morgan State University. My name is Jared Ball. I'm a professor of communication studies, currently in the African-American Diaspora Studies program. Happily helping to build and extend that project and that program here at Morgan State. And I'm happy to play host this morning or this afternoon for a conversation around Pan-Africanism and the African diaspora here at Morgan State. But before we do that, I want to first invite our illustrious Dean of College of Liberal Arts, Mbari Ngom, to please, please, if you would, just step right there and give us a few words of introduction and welcome, and we appreciate you, and thank you very much, Dean Ngom. Actually, I thought they were, okay, there you go, even better. Thank you very much. And clearly, our Dean is shaming us a little bit in the outfit. He's styling on us a little bit. No, I appreciate it. Good morning. Is it on? So we're all self-muting today? Is that what's happening? We're all, uh-oh.
Okay. Hello?
Nope. Yep,
Hello.
there you go.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to come to this important convocation. And just to let you know that it's an honor to be here and to also to welcome members of the community who are here to attend this convocation. Welcome to the National Treasure and on our beautiful campus. I'm Barry Rum, the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Morgan State University, and I bring greetings on behalf of President David Wilson, and also on behalf of Dr. Hong Tao, Provost and Senior Vice President for here. Last but not least, on behalf of the faculty, students, and staff. Hello? Okay. So also, last but not least, on behalf of the faculty, student, and staff of the College of Liberal Arts, I also bring greetings. As I said, it's a pleasure and indeed an honor and an opportunity to extend also a special welcome to Professor Eberichi Cecilia Usuagu, one of the TED Fund's doctoral students and scholars who are spending an academic year with us. With also to Dr. Dina El-Mahdi, Associate Professor of Accounting in the Earls Grave Schools of Business and Management. And so we are neighbors anyway. So welcome to the College of Liberal Arts. So Pan-Africanism, the theme of this year's Bill of Rights Trans-Africa Days convocation is timely. For it comes at a time when the African Union, an offspring of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, will be celebrating its 20th anniversary in 2022, African Union. Established in May 1963, the then Organization of African Unity, OAU, quote from the charter, was the manifestation of the Pan-African vision for an Africa that was united, free, and in control of its own destiny. And this was solemnized in the OAU Charter, in which the founding father recognized that freedom, equality, justice, and dignity were essential objectives for the achievement of the legitimate aspirations of the African people, end quote. So it is evident that the OAU Charter statement clearly indicate that, quote, the guiding philosophy that was that of Pan-Africanism, which was central on African socialism and promoted African unity, the communal characteristic and practices of African communities, and a drive to embrace African culture and common heritage, end quote. So, the establishment of the African Union in 2002 represent what was described as, quote, the third phase of the institutionalization of Pan-Africanism, end quote. Pan-Africanism, and I guess that will be discussed here, the history, was a movement that was born not in Africa, but outside of the continent. And it has gone through many crises and navigated through turbulent waters. But it is one of the few movements that has survived colonialism, 2 world wars, the Cold War, low-intensity wars, and the pandemic, I hope. But in the post-independent era, it got trapped in the maze of the post-independence era, in the maze of, got trapped, in the labyrinth of the post-independent era. I rarely use post-colonial term post-colonial. So, though it has served as a guiding principle and ideology for African nationalism and the struggle for liberation from colonial subjection in many European and colonized territory in Africa and beyond, it did not quite achieve its goal in the spirit of the leading figures of the movement, like Henry Sylvester Williams, Marcus Garvey, William E. Du Bois, Antenor Fermat, Nnamdi Azikiwe, George Padmore, Francis Kofi, Kwame Nkrumah, Cheikh Anta Diop, David Diop, Sékou Touré, Mamadou Dia, Patrice Emery Lumumba, Modibo Keïta, Thomas Sankara, Djibo Bakary, Nelson Mandela, Tidjane Baidili, and Samba Diagne, and many others. But in some quarters, Pan-Africanism in the 21st century was compared to and described by some as African Renaissance, Renaissance africaine, a movement that seeks to build on the guiding principle of Pan-Africanism, that is freedom and independence for African country and the end of dependency. For Senegalese sociologist Abdoulaye Niang from the Université Gaston Berger in Senegal, in Saint-Louis, Senegal, this movement should begin with what he calls, quote, the recovery of mental and intellectual sovereignty of Africa. And also the redefinition of the relations, if any, with institutions like the IMF and the World Bank laboratory of ideas implemented through neoliberal policies based on the euphemism of, quote, democracy, competition, and growth, end quote. Instead, this 21st century vision of Pan-Africanism should resort to and rely on what's been described as African political thought or thoughts and development project. So this is what has led Aminata Dramane Traoré, an author, politician, and political activist from Mali, to state and stress, quote, democracy as defined by the Western nation does not interest us. We'd rather ask ourselves, how can we establish a different type of democracy by giving citizens a real control of the process, end quote. From this perspective, Pan-Africanism should not be an affair of the elites, but should be a participatory process involving those who create social wealth, according to quoting Ababakar Barros Fall. But this also should not lose sight of the African diaspora. What do I mean by that? African expatriate. What role do they play in what's been defined as 21st century Pan-Africanism? I guess at that, what historian Joseph Kizerbo from Burkina Faso was trying to answer, at least was trying to set the stage for an ongoing conversation and finding solution when he wrote the book À quand l'Afrique, which is Africa When, in 2013. And also along the very same line, Aminata Dramane Traoré and Boubacar Boris Diop wrote La gloire des imposteurs, lettres sur le Mali, l'Afrique, The Glory of the Impostors, Letters on Mali and Africa, where they are also reflecting on Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance. In closing, I just would like to express again my gratitude beyond measure to Dr. Jared Ball and Dr. Edwin Johnson for coordinating this important convocation and conversation that is about to take place, and to just engage it in a very meaningful conversation. I have no doubt that that will be the case. And my gratitude also goes to the participant, Dr. Jeremiah Dubois, Dr. Herbert Brewer, and Dr. El Mahdi. To all of you, thank you. And to the participant, okay, thank you for honoring us with your presence, whether here in situ or virtually. And again, thank you very much for the invitation. Have a good
Thank
day.
you.
All right.
Thank you, Dean and Gomes. Definitely thank you very much, Dean and Gomes, for setting that context. And I also want to echo the thanks to Dr. Johnson and Mr. Ciaran Greenidge as well for helping with this, put all this together. So to try to honor the opening remarks of our dean, I do want us to have what I hope is a rousing conversation with colleagues and our guests from Nigeria, who I'll introduce just now very briefly. Our guest joining us virtually from Nigeria, and forgive any mispronunciation, Eberichi Cecilia Osogwu, who is an environmental science doctoral student and part of the Nigerian TET Fund Scholar Program. She's joining us virtually. To my left is the interim chair of the Department of History, Professor Jeremiah Dubois. To my right, from, of course, the accounting department, Dr. Dina F. El Mahdi. And to my far right, also from the Department of History, Dr. Herbert Brewer. And with some intention, selfishly wanting to have a conversation for this Pan-African, Trans-Africa Bill of Rights convocation around Pan-Africanism in the 21st century, particularly here at Morgan State, there was an attempt to tap into our wonderful diaspora representatives here at Morgan. We have a very diverse and diaspora representative faculty and staff and student body. So I wanted to reach out to them to have to engage in this conversation. And I will just start by asking, and I guess we could start with our guest joining virtually, given that, you know, at least virtually she's joining from the farthest distance. I'm very much interested in just some introductory remarks from any of you about how you both, well, let me just say it this way. Given the important context set by Dean and Gomes and his summary recitation of the history of Pan-Africanism, I'm very much interested in how each of you define Pan-Africanism and how you see it practiced or engaged in your experience here at Morgan State. And I'm very much interested in the nature of the laughs that we got. I wanted, where did that, anyway. So Ms. Osogwu, again, forgive me, if we could start with you, if you would talk with us a little bit about how you define Pan-Africanism and then how you've seen that definition or how you've experienced your definition during your time at Morgan or engaged in our, at least virtual community. Is she able to hear, and are we able to hear her? Are we not able to hear her coming out of the computer? I don't think we do. Well, I tell you what, Professor Dubois, could we have you start with we'll start with you then, and while we get this set up. How do you define Pan-Africanism, and how has that been experienced by you here at Morgan?
Okay, thank you. Well, literally, Pan-Africanism is generally described as the movement of peoples of African descent towards the promotion of peoples of African descent, unity and solidarity. But it really goes much, much beyond that, because from that perspective, people are looking at it just from the point of view of political and institutional Pan-Africanism. So I define it actually more as a multi-dimensional, multi-sectional phenomenon where you define unity from the perspective of political, economic, social, cultural. And so it is an all-embracing phenomenon. But even then, Pan-Africanism cannot be understood without situating it within the context of the African identity. So we are talking of a global African identity that embraces or comprises people of African descent, and then, all over the world. And then, of course, we have to situate it within the context of what gave rise to Pan-Africanism. So it may to put this within the context of where they are coming from. That for the historical diaspora, Africa as a continent serves as a form of identification. But that for the contemporary diaspora, Africa as a continent does not serve as a form of identification because these people are coming from different countries, and even within the same countries, different ethnicities. And so the fact that they say, for instance, that they identify themselves first as maybe as Nigerians or Ghanaians, Yoruba or Igbo, does not mean that they do not believe in the concept of Pan-Africanism. And so, yeah, let me stop there.
Okay, very good. Are we all set? Okay. So the same question again, Ms. Osogwu. I'm going to struggle with that apparently. I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I feel like that. I haven't been given, I guess I'm given permission now to do that. I feel a little uncomfortable with that, but I hear you. I appreciate that. But anyway, please go ahead. And if you heard the question, how do you define Pan-Africanism, and how have you seen that definition play out in your experience with Morgan State?
Okay. Am I on?
Oh no, that's actually too loud now. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'm going to the opportunity. I'm to be part of this program. Pan-Africanism for me is an international movement that tries to bring Africans, both living inside and outside Africa together in unity. For me, unity can do a lot of things in terms of social development, in terms of economic development, academic development. Yeah, when people are united, right, it's a structure that can move everything forward. Yeah, coming to my being part of this, yeah, because it's not for Pan-Africanism, it's not for the of trying to bring people together to be able to integrate in the community that they don't belong to. I will be in MSU. Yeah, it's one of the things that got me there, and that is why I always encourage global education, global learning. It's one of the things I'm actually trying to bring us together. Yeah, no matter where you find yourself, especially in Africa, for me is to make sure Africans are united, speak with one voice wherever they are. And because they are actually contributing to the economy of everywhere they find themselves, they're actually contributing to the development of everywhere they find themselves. Therefore, they should be able to fight or to, crusade about their freedom, about being part of that society. They can't be contributing to that society where not being part of it or being segregated or being discriminated. I don't, that's not what I want. That's not how I want to see it. I want to see an Africa that wherever we find ourselves, we stand in solidarity. All right, we stand in unity so that whatever belongs to us, whatever right that's supposed to be accrued to us, will definitely get to us. So even here in MSU, even though I've not been able to come to the States, right? But I'm feeling belonged, really. There's no discrimination for those of us here and those over there. We're trying to have that integration. And I want to see, even when I come over there, a better one that will be able to incorporate our social cultural activities so that we can be able to share. One of the things that have been marrying this Africa movement is that our differences, right? So if we will come together in unity and be able to share those differences, accommodate one another, then drop some misconceptions because you can't get it right by being far. You can't get it right by being away. You can't get it right from the window. You need to be inside for you to be able to know how to push it forward. So for the Pan Africans, put more effort in whatever they do. They adhere, they obey the law, they try to put in their best, wherever they find themselves. I encourage this movement because it will definitely help put us together and bring up the Africans we always desire. Thank you.
It was a little bit, okay, good, very good. Professor Mahdi, same question to you. Your summary position on Pan-Africanism and how have you experienced it here at Morgan?
So I'm from accounting background. My undergrad and both my grad degree was accounting, so I had to do some search on the Pan-Africanism means. And it turned out to be I actually know what it is. It's just I didn't read it before. So in my understanding, based on I guess as Professor Nabum identified, it's a movement or ideology, and it's meant to solidify or unite all Africans together in order to improve our economic, social, and political programs and move towards the best for everyone. I see that it's very important at some point in time, and I see that the African Union was issued in 1963 mainly to carry on this perspective and role and mission and vision, which is very novel. And I've seen that it helps Africans inside and outside Africa to feel that sense of being belonging to the institution where they are, and whether inside or outside Africa. So I was intrigued by the concept, actually, the fact that we are, regardless of whether you are inside or outside Africa, we should unite. I was intrigued by the fact it's like involves all Africans. It doesn't matter where are you from. Um, Regarding my experience at Pan-Africanism, I realized that's actually the reason I'm sitting with you here today. Because when I was hired, I was told you're African and you're going to be American, so we need African Americans, which happened.
Oh, wow.
So the reason I was hired is because of Africa and now I'm African American. So that gives me the sense of belonging. And for a second, I was very amused by it. So we do lots of efforts in terms of like helping Africans to unifying with Africa. I'm very proud of my colleague, for example, in the School of Business, Professor Khan, who actually run a very successful conference last month, moving in and out of Africa. And actually, it was very well attended from countries within Africa and outside Africa.
We also have Ghana program where we are actually going to, it's just coronavirus kind of slowed that down a little bit, but we should actually be teaching in Ghana sooner or later. So I love the terminology, I love the concept, I love the mission and vision. I see it to some extent available or some certain varying degrees applicable at Morgan State in terms of our support and unity and integration with Africa, whether we're inside or outside Africa. So that's just my perspective about the concept, and thank you for letting me learn more about it.
Right on. Thank you. Dr. Brewer, same question.
Thank you, and hello to everybody. So for the most part, since I think we've defined the terrain, what Pan-Africanism is for the most part, let me look at it at a slightly different angle. I think that Pan-Africanism itself, including the way it's been defined, has been contested. It's an important, powerful ideology, but it's always been a contested ideology from its very roots. When the first Pan-African conference was held in 1900 in London, people came with different perspectives. They, of course, had things that held them together, but they had major differences, and those differences became seen as it emerged. And if you look at the career of Pan-Africanism, if you will, to borrow a term, throughout the 20th century, we've had Pan-Africanism falling into these different schools, revolutionary Pan-Africanism, radical Pan-Africanism. There are more conservative versions of Pan-Africanism. And indeed, when the Organization of African Unity was formed in 1963, it was the result of a compromise. And right immediately preceding its creation, it had broken up the Casablanca group and the Monrovia group, and all of these compromises were worked out there. And indeed, in the post-independence era, we sort of also have seen a whole variety of currents. So it's a contested ideology at that level. And to me, that's one of its strengths. Even though at the same time, it also creates, puts limitations and creates obstacles in terms of achieving these ideas that propel it. In terms of Morgan, so we can talk a little bit about that, this whole notion of it being contested. I recall a conversation, I listened to Chinua Achebe, the great late writer from Nigeria, talking about a discussion he had with the Somali writer Nuruddin Farah. And he said, Farah turned to him and asked him, Chinua, when did you become an African? When did you start to see yourself as African? And Achebe said, up until that point, he had never really considered completely that as a problematic, to problematize that. He just took that for granted. Or then it made him rethink, have I always thought of myself as an African? When did I become conscious or aware of it? And of course, the dean had started earlier on making the point about it being something that was brought to the African continent. The Congolese writer Budimbe has that nice argument in The Invention of Africa, where he's like talking about the process by which this idea, emerges, coming out of those concrete sorts of circumstances in the past. In terms of Morgan State University, I would say that Morgan State University is a Pan-African university, even if it's not in its charter, it's not written, de facto, as people are saying here. If we look at the student body, if we look at the faculty, if we look at the curriculum, and that's been the case for a very long time, in terms of the interest of the people who work here, in terms of the people who come here, in terms of Morgan's own impact. Right today, with these international engagements that Morgan is involved in, look at where it's going, right? It's going to Africa. And it's like an organic, natural kind of fit. So in reality, if not in law or formally, Morgan is a Pan-African space. I forgot who was making that point. I think it was Dr. Dubois, about the various waves of immigration, the various sorts of diasporas, historic and more recent. Just a large amount of our student body are not, if they're not immigrants themselves from Africa, they're the children, first generation Americans, the children of immigrants. We've got a sizable part of our population. And for many of them, this is an interesting experience for them, meaning, at what point do they become American? At what point, where does their African identity lie? And in my classes, I know that, and I'm sure many professors or faculty can attest to that. students grapple with that. They're thinking about that. This whole notion of who am I? Am I really an African Nigerian, or am I, Yoruba? Who am I? Where do I sort of slot these things? And of course, all these discussions amongst first generation Americans, immigrants from Africa versus, quote unquote native African Americans, in terms of, where do my loyalties lie? Where are my identities? But I think these are I think it's a great discussion. Things to put on the table.
I mean, one of the reasons why I was very interested in this conversation and requested even that we incorporate the SODA, the Solidarity of Dispersed Africans, is because over the years, recently, there has been a very popular hashtag of the exact reverse order, and others. You talk about Native Black America. There has been, and not that it hasn't always existed, but there has been a rise and an increase in a popularization of this idea recently that Black Americans have a very distinct history that should be seen not only as distinct, but should be carried on as distinct from the rest of the diaspora. That Pan-Africanism among some, as I've seen it in my classroom and elsewhere in sort of in the zeitgeist, has been, again, challenged. This idea that it's old, it's retrograde. And then it even comes up in my classes every semester in one form or another. Various perspectives from the diaspora, questioning, debating, disagreeing, finding similarity, etc. So I was very interested to hear from colleagues more of this question of how do you see the state of Pan-Africanism today on Morgan's campus, and is Morgan doing enough to raise this history? And maybe to even bias admitted, encourage a greater Pan-African understanding as we deal with so many from around the diaspora. So I'm wondering, again, if it's not too much of a redundancy in me asking it this way, but I am wanting to hear more from each of you, including you, Cecilia, about, I don't know, is Morgan doing enough to promote and encourage that members of the diaspora engage and learn more about one another? Or do we see too much of what's replicated outside of the institution in terms of the divisions being replicated here on campus? And I don't have a particular order. Does anybody have a burning desire to jump in and respond or comment?
Okay,
Please, sure.
Maybe let me go back first to the issue of the contested space, even among those I would describe as the historical African diaspora. But one thing we should understand is that, as is the case with most ideas, and you do not have a uniformity of ideas. There are differences. Even within the historical African diaspora, you can identify different schools of thought in terms of their relationship or what they think are their relationship to Africa and how they are identified. For instance, you have the Afrocentric school of thought that says, well, African Americans are not Americans. They are Africans, pure and simple. And within that Afrocentric school of thought, you also even have some differences. I will talk about, you have the extreme Afrocentric, like the Molefe Ashanti group. Then there are the other Afrocentrics who, of course, identify that way, but do not go up to that extent. But you have those that we actually identify as the majority in terms of the historical African diaspora, those who follow the Du Boisian perspective of the double consciousness, that you have Africans who are that Africans in the US are both Africans and then they are both Americans, because in terms of culture, in terms of history, in terms of identity, they came from Africa, and those Africanisms and identity cannot be removed. But at the same time, their Americanness cannot be removed because of the realities of the fact that they grew up in America, and then, of course, have been historically products of racism, discrimination, and everything. And so his double consciousness perspective therefore represents that hyphenated African Americans, as is actually the case with every immigrant group in the US. Like I normally tell students that apart from Native Americans, every American is a hyphenated American. And that seems to be the dominant perspective. Then you have, of course, the extreme perspective represented by someone like Kate Ginsburg, who was a journalist incidentally in Tanzania, who actually sees himself as purely an American, not an African. And also, what's this man's name? This film star, one of the oldest African-American film,
Morgan Freeman.
Morgan Freeman,
Oh, no.
who also says that he's an American, but he's not an African. So the point, therefore, is that you've always had that contested space in terms of how even the historical African Americans describe themselves. Then within Morgan campus, that contestation, of course, this is a place of ideas, can also not be removed. But as was mentioned by Brewer, right from the beginning, Morgan State University and most HBCUs in the US have actually been spaces where where Pan-Africanism has been promoted. In this case, Lincoln University of Pennsylvania occupies a very important place in terms of fostering Pan-Africanism. So two of the greatest Pan-Africanists went to school there, Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria and Kwame Nkrumah, who later became the father of Pan-Africanism, went to that school. Then at Morgan, you've always had students from different African and Caribbean countries who have attended Morgan State University. And they are spread all over Africa and what have you. So in terms of Morgan's engagement with Pan-Africanism, that is an area that I think that Morgan can actually exploit. There are a number of products of Morgan State University who occupy important positions in the diasporan world, who can be engaged in terms of alumni relations and all that. Then, of course, Morgan is doing a lot now in terms of having connections with universities in Africa. Then there is this third fund with Nigeria. But there is the other aspect where I think Morgan and other HBCUs can also do a lot. And that is, apart from sending students abroad, there should also be a process of, in terms of undergraduates, trying to create an exchange program where undergraduate students from African universities can actually come to Morgan as exchange students. But of course, there is a problem there. Many of these schools will not be able to pay for the students to come. And that is where we might have to discuss about either grants or something in terms of having them to experience it. Because what we actually have is more of the movement from the north to the south. There's also the need for those from the south to come to schools like this and experience Pan-Africanism and experience this interaction, as opposed to students who either their parents are from Africa or the Caribbean and school here, or those who their parents can pay their fees and come here and are much more concerned with getting the certificates.
Right. All right. Any other thoughts? Cecilia, did you want to chime in? Anybody else have any thoughts on that particular question? I don't think- get my mic checked. Is she?
Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. My own perspective is in promoting this Africanism and to what extent we can do that. All right. It is a work in progress. I have a problem with people burden themselves by diversity. You know, you feel you're diverse because the way you believe, maybe in religion or in social cultural aspect. But we're talking about humanity, right? If you're seeing it from the human aspect, it is an easy thing for you to tolerate one another or accept one another. Because I don't want to see Africans whereby the torturer become the torturer. No. You know, because you see, most times you see, you know, Africans, Africa, let me not call it a Africans, Africans that come over to the States, right? Meeting with people, African American people, and you see that's some sort of little discrimination happening around there. That kind of behavior is not going to get us anywhere, really. Because until we get it right, until we see ourselves as one another, as brothers, as sisters, and you know, be our brother's keeper, it's not going to work out. No matter the extent we try to preach it, no matter the extent our crusade is going to be, it's getting close to people. You know, showing it in your character, showing it in what you do. Just like Mr. Grenade was talking about one tribe. If you don't bring people together, if you don't allow people to share their views, if you don't want people to air their view, how they feel about it, how they see it, how they want to take it, you will get the best out of this movement, right? So I would like, in a situation whereby I don't actually know much enough of what is happening in MSc because I've been remotely, taking my classes. But I would like to see a situation where people are given that opportunity, that platform to express their views, whether they are right or wrong, so that they get corrected. I want people where people can be allowed to integrate socially and culturally, bring up what they have, even if it's really just white. Yeah, because one thing I've known about African Americans or even Africans is religiously they take it by faith. There are some things they might not really question, but because their faith promotes that, because morally I can't do this, morally I can't do that, morally I need to be this way. They tend to follow that way. And that's one of the things that I admire about Africans, really. And that's one of the things I know that can bring a unity together by allowing people, no matter how it is, where you're coming from, whether African in Africa or African American, we should incorporate. We should allow ourselves to be together and allow yourself to, get culture. Like we are in Africa here, we have a lot of culture that we can display. Unfortunately, for those in African American, they don't have much culture, right? So the integration is something that I would like to, open up, allow people from diverse places because Africa is a very big continent, very populated. If we can allow people to air their view and know where our controversies are lying, we can be able to, do better in integration and people can come up with their views. Just like the world is changing, every day, we can be able to know how things we didn't get right, things we are supposed to get right, how we're supposed to move forward to make sure that wherever we find ourselves, we are united. Yeah. Just like this MOU we're talking about Tech Fund and all that. Just like Bob said about integrating, doing student exchange program. These are one of the things that we can actually catch them young. It mustn't be, when we get to our stage, to come to do like the doctorate program and all that. You can actually start catching them young, so that they can be able to have that change of perspective, that misconception about I don't belong here. It would be a nice thing, for me, if we can start integrating our youth, our teens, from that level, to be able to understand what this movement is all about, so that you don't just come and grow old and start thinking about the generation that you're leaving behind and start struggling for it. If you can catch them young at this time, starting from our children, our teens, to be able to integrate them. This is the reason why we are doing this. This is our history. This is our culture. This is what we want to achieve. This is destined to achieve it. And this is what we want you to continue with. It will be a nice thing. Yeah. Thank you.
So no, thank you. And frankly, I'm not hearing everything I think clearly as I would like to. But one thing I believe I heard that resonates is getting to people young. And Professor Mahdi, I don't mean to forgive me if I hope this doesn't put you on the spot too uncomfortably. But I was thinking about, because I'm watching what is my favorite Pan-African world football team that just happens to play under the flag of France. And I'm watching with my daughters, and I'm praising the fact that Karim Benzema, and I hope people are getting all these references. This is world football talk right here. Don't get, anyway. I'm sorry, there's so many internal jokes happening at once. But I'm watching Karim Benzema, and I'm saying how great it is to see him back, the Algerian descended striker, back on the France national team with all of his other French Africans. And I'm saying my favorite Pan-African, and I'm saying, and my youngest daughter says, as young people are in their moments of honesty, why are you referring to him as an African? Karim Benzema looks European. He looks white. I don't understand what So I said, oh no, baby girl. And I went through the whole thing, this Algerian, North African, the colonial. And I said, the French see him as a colonized African claim, anyway, so I was trying to put it in that context and try to bring it into a Pan-African discussion to say that even despite his look or his being from North Africa and having a particular, maybe a different background from the French perspective, maybe, or from a Pan-African perspective, he is seen as and treated as and related to very much as an African in the colonial experience in relationship to France. So anyway, I just use it as a segue in this whole getting to them young. And I was trying to use this as a way to get to my children and say, no, snatch them into a Pan-African consciousness. But I'm using it as a segue to bring you into this conversation. You know, when and maybe even to respond to anything that's been said here. But in terms of encouraging the diaspora from wherever that diaspora is coming and forming to see themselves as part of that history, and then of course in terms of Egypt, I'm thinking of the Nkrumah, Nasser family combination, all that kind of stuff. But anyway, I don't have a particularly well-formed question for you, and I apologize for that, but I'm trying to use that as a segue to bring you into the conversation, have you elaborate or respond to anything you've heard so far.
Sure, I'd like to chime in, and thank you very much for that very thoughtful conversation. When I was reading about Pan-Africans, I realized that, as Professor Ngum mentioned, it's kind of diverse, and it differs from culture to culture, location to location, and it takes some time, form of extreme. And some people would actually think of Africanism like Black internationalism. And I think that's what you are referring to, the fact that to be from Africa, you have to be Black, which is very hurtful, and it's actually very dangerous as well. We talk about Pan-Africanism in Morgan State, and we want to get united, which is very important and it's very good. But we also have to be very careful that we are not all from Africa, first of all. And we have to care for one another. Majority of my department, for example, will be surprised. They are not African American. Majority, statistically speaking, they're from different continents. So we have to be very careful when we try to care for each other and unintentionally exclude others in general. So I think that's what you're talking about when you talk about U.S. born versus Black U.S. born versus Black who were born in Africa. That's not what Pan-Africanism mentioned. Pan-Africanism unites African from every corner of Africa, from all colors, from all religion, inside, outside. So it's inclusive. And it's actually, the definition is intriguing and important given that we are survivors. We all came from different portions of Africa, whether us or our ancestors. So we actually sort of like made our way here to the largest, greatest country in the world. So we have to get back one way or another, unite to help Africans. Like, a simple example, the variant of coronavirus, the Omicron, it's in South Africa, and we know that 1/3 of the country only vaccinated. So our job in the United States, if we have enough, we should help and we should extend hand. I like the idea of Pan-Africanism again, but I see what you're talking about. I've seen it. I don't want to speak much more personal. This is not the stage to speak on personal, incident or event. That's small aspects here. We're talking about more of like micro level, all of us as an institution, Morgan State. So I would like to worry against, exclusion of certain people in general.
Right on. Dr. Brewer, same question. And if you have a particular response, otherwise I have others questions to get you started if you like as well. But if you want to add on, please go ahead. Yeah. Well, I thought I would do it this way because I know that I'm sure we have some comments or questions from our audience participants as well. But so I thought, and I'm trying to be mindful of the time. I have two broad questions that I'll just throw out and invite. And some of it is in response to what I've heard here, and others that I'd like would have wanted to hear more discussed anyway. But one, I use this this point in my classes a lot to try to make the point about to draw some focus to some unifying themes, but with an intent to be provocative. So I'm going to invite that same thing here. For instance, so Professor Dubois, when you bring up some of the diaspora formation and the differences of experiencing being on the continent or in the diaspora, one of the things that I bring up in my classes I'm interested in hearing a discussion about is that, for instance, nothing on the African continent is anymore, the African continent is not currently formed in an authentically African way any more than Black communities here in the United States or elsewhere have been formed. So in other words, like Jamaica is no more authentically African or less authentically African than Nigeria or Ghana. These are creations of imperialism of the West. So when we talk about who is an American or an African or where these isms cross over, I like to try to encourage, even just again to be provocative and challenge, to say, East Baltimore is equally constructed as, Western Tanzania, for instance. They're equal constructs with imposed identities included. And then, of course, I think of the aphorism coming out of, Malcolm and others, that if you take rabbits out of the forest and put them in an oven and they procreate, are those children biscuits? So that's one question. This issue of authenticity. Where does the African become the American, or the Caribbean become? And then also, I'm also interested, do continental Africans come to HBCUs like Morgan, or does the diaspora, not just the continent, but the diaspora come to the Morgan or HBCUs to get the Black experience the way other Black students sometimes do, or is it more just an issue of what is available? So I'm just curious what your experience with any of that, or responses to any of that might be. And we can start with you, Dr.
Sure.
Bailey.
So historically speaking, the diaspora is coming to the HBCUs because that's the only thing that's available to them. That's a reality. So they're coming from the Caribbean, they're coming from Africa. That's why they're going to Lincoln and going to Morgan and going to Howard, et cetera, because they could not go to Yale and Harvard. Simple, being excluded from those spaces. So that's that generation. With the Cold War in the 1960s, there's a big change that starts to take place, and the big elite institutions of higher learning in the country make an effort, a targeted effort, to bring people from Africa and the diaspora to those particular spaces, and we're sort of seeing part of. There's a kind of a long-term implication in that as well, and then you sort of have the children of immigrants. I should say, by the way, that between 1970, after the Immigration Act was changed, because in the 1920s, they shut the door and they it's like specifically race-conscious Immigration Act. After 1960s, and by 1970s, there's this new flow that comes in, and doors are open that were shut before. The amount of people, Black people, I'm saying, African people, people of African descent who entered the United States are more, 2 times more. I think they calculate something like 1 million. That's twice as many as the historical African diaspora coming into the United States during the entirety from 1619 to the shutdown of the transatlantic slave trade. So that short period of time, meaning from like 1970 to the year 2000. So there's clearly, it has long-term implications in terms of the transformation of what it means to be African or Black, and it will continue to have here. Jollof rice is now becoming part of popular culture. I'm just giving one quick kind of example, of some of those changes that we're already sort of seeing there, that you would not have seen 50 years before that, 40 years before that. So this question of identity is like constantly being changed, including this whole struggle over authenticity. That also again is a kind of fight and a struggle about that, and I think that actually you can have people those dual identities, and quadruple identity, even self-identities within the African American in terms of African American history. There are arguments. So there was Negro. Actually, there was colored and then Negro, and these changes were being reflected in the census, for example. And then there was Black, and then there's African American. And actually, in the 2020 census, the word Black, which had been removed, was put back. So if you filled your census form recently, you'll see both African American and you'll see Black, which was not the case in 2000 when they had removed Black. And so again, these sorts of boundaries, these contested identities back and forth, those things happen. That's kind of like some background to reflecting these sorts of changes, these dynamics that we're discussing. I kind of had a slightly, I don't know, in terms of time, comment I wanted to make about like practical things for students here at Morgan. And in terms of the types of suggestions, we, of course, at Morgan, we have study abroad programs. We try to build it and encourage students to do that. We're talking about exchange and those sorts of things. One of the things that stood out to me traveling around the African continent, I was in East Africa and West Africa. And what I noticed was I would see European students recent graduates of school, so they're like in the early 20s, they just graduated in a whole variety of professions or starting their careers anyway, working in Africa, working in Nairobi, working in Abuja, working in Abidjan, right? And these are like kids from Western Europe, bright people and interested, but they're starting their careers and they're starting there, right? And they're learning things, right? They're not going to be in Africa, in Nigeria, Kenya for the rest of their lives. They're learning, they're expanding their experience, they're building those CVs incredibly. And I can sort of imagine, what they're going to do and be in 10, 20 years, that sort of thing. And what stood out for me is that no students, no African American, no Black American, no students from the United States are in those spaces, working for NGOs, and that's a large subsector. I'm talking about hundreds of young Europeans who are in those spaces. Same sort of degrees coming out of business schools, bachelor's degrees in business, bachelor's degrees in engineering, and that sort of thing. And I'm like, okay, yes, like it's great, I think, opportunity that sort of sits there. And we need to do something about that. We really do. Would definitely benefit our students.
Right on.
So,
Yeah, please, anybody? Yeah.
okay, I mean, this actually, in the African Studies Association 2 years ago, the paper actually presented was Global Africa or Pan-African Diaspora, examining the Black identity. And my argument was that the dominant conception of Pan-Africanism or even African diaspora is too transatlantic, is Western, is Eurocentric, in the sense that, and it's racialized, just the point you were making. Because once it is racialized, it removes, for instance, people from North Africa, because you tend to see it from a racialized perspective. And that's actually how some of the African diaspora still has been constructed. And we can understand why. Because things like the Haitian Revolution and, of course, the attack on Ethiopia created some form of pride among people of Black descent. And that became a source of, if you like, empowerment, trying to liberate and then promoting unity. But my argument is that cut away a number of people of African descent who are in the Middle East, who are in Eastern Europe, because there are a number of Africans who now see themselves as Arabs, for instance, because of the different experiences in terms of slavery. Because in the case of the Islamic world, those who were brought from Africa were completely Islamized and Arabized, in the sense that an important source, and that brings the point you were making in terms of naming, was that in terms of names, their African names were stripped from them. And then they were given Islamic names, and they actually could not identify their place in that society from the context of those that colonized them. So when we talk about usually Pan-Africanism, African diaspora, we tend to forget that those people are part of Africa. And so my argument is that actually in place of Pan-Africa or African diaspora, that we probably might be thinking in terms of the word global Africa, which removes the racialization, which removes that transatlantic aspect of it, and then captures people who, one way or the other, can be traced to the African continent, irrespective of color. And that becomes important because even within Africa itself, you also, at a point, in spite of the role played by NASA in terms of promoting Pan-Africanism, and Kwame Nkrumah marrying an Egyptian woman, but because of, again, the prevalence of these Middle Easts as an idea, you tend to have sometimes this division that those from North Africa, they are actually part of the Arabs. They're actually part of the Middle East. And so even within North Africa, you see this contested identity among people from there. And that was part of what, for instance, Gaddafi was trying to transcend in terms of his trying to promote Pan-Africanism. And so, well, it was, I know it generated a lot of debate, but my argument was that I would prefer the term global Africa as a more race-neutral term, and as a term that captures the realities of peoples of African descent all over the world, east, west, north, or wherever.
Can I just add a little to that part? You sort of prompted me to think about how our knowledge structures, our libraries and classification systems, the State Department, the World Bank, they speak of the Middle East and North Africa as one. You know, that's how they look at it. You've got an assistant secretary say for Middle East and North Africa, and then you've got a secretary for South Saharan Africa. And the World Bank has a division for South Saharan Africa and another division for Middle East and North Africa. And when you go into the library, I mean, you get a division, the classification of knowledge is the same way, but just sort of.
It's taught that way in high school textbooks too. That it'll say Egypt is in the Middle East. It won't even acknowledge the geographic location anymore. But anyway,
I feel too much support, by the way, to please. Thank you very much. I feel too much support like the discussion is towards like including people from Middle East within Africa, like even that. So I feel too much support. I'm intrigued so far. Thank you.
Cecilia, did you want to jump in, or I'm not sure if you were waiting to make a comment. Otherwise, if not, if there are any comments or questions from those in attendance, or I don't know if we have the capability of getting anything online, I'd love to hear it. Yes, sir. Oh, thank you, Dr. Brewer.
Hi, my name's Anthony Chandler. I'm one of the students here, undergraduate. Here in the United States, there's a resistance by Black Americans. You commented on it, resistance by Black Americans to identify with Africa, some of us within the Black community. How do you create a space to where we can bridge that and get more Black Americans to identify with Africa so we can unify under Pan-Africanism?
Is that? Oh. Cecilia, would you like to answer that? And if not, can we ask you to mute? Oh, I'm sorry. Did anybody want to answer that one first? Or you want to take the second question? Okay, yeah, go ahead. That's great.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. You see, I've been enjoying this, and I really want to thank you for.
Yes. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Sorry, Cecilia, are you trying to jump in? Because we have another question from the audience. Yeah, can we mute her, please, and then we'll just go on with the question.
I think someone is interfering. Maybe you want to mute all. Yeah, you probably want to mute all.
Yeah, sir. I just want to chip in something. Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Am I
Yes.
audible now?
Yes, you are.
We seem to have lost
Technology.
Okay, is that okay now?
I think I'll proceed. Yeah, I've been enjoying this, and it has been a learning moment always. I often tell my students, I am a professor specific. I'm not professor general. So in other words, you keep learning, and it's been so fantastic listening to the panelists. And indeed, when Dean Ngong was up there, and I completed this lucidly presented opening remarks, the first question I asked him is, you forgot about LACAS. I said, the Latin American and the Caribbean studies, that is African diaspora focused. I think it was in 2006 or 7 that it put some of us together. Then I was in the history and geography department, and we had that grant to open up. So I was wondering what you can tell us or share with the audience, or maybe Dean Ngong will talk about that later on. the general question for all of you is, what do you think about Kwanzaa? Because one thing is recurring when we talk about African diaspora, and that is the triadic relationship, which Pierre Esther referred to as a double consciousness that I think Professor Dubois mentioned in one of his interventions. Wherever the Africans or people of African descent, whether through the Indian Ocean that predates the Atlantic Ocean that we've not mentioned, or we kind of, mention, don't let me say we gloss over, because that would be too, or through the Sahara, through the Mediterranean, to what is today Middle East. There's something, whether they are castrated, inability to reproduce, okay, as it happened in the 17th, all the way to even 19th century on that side. Or we talk about across the Atlantic and the issue of Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving for who? That's another debate. But the point is, beyond the triadic relationship and the double consciousness, we now have celebration of Kwanzaa. And Kwanzaa, how would you or have you contextualize it in your classroom? I'm putting my colleagues in the history and geography department or the African diaspora program. How have you continually contextualized it beyond the theories? So Kwanzaa, very important. I want you to shed more light on that. And other, non-institutionalized programs. What about the diasporic associations? Okay. What about engaging students in what I call the poetic verses? One of the things that I did towards the end of my first term, let me put it that way, as a faculty here, was to engage students in turning the text into poems. And you have this diverse number of students at the Honors African Diaspora class, the General Diaspora class, and the Masters Modern African History class that I taught between 06 and 09. And at the end of the day, when you pick up that book that came out in 2010, The African Diaspora, Historical Analysis, Poetic Verses, and Pedagogy, you'll see the pedagogy of what we did and how those poems, except for the real African name, real in quote, you will think the poems were written by the enslaved Africans. So the question then is, how do we marry the pedagogy in the classroom and in our household? Thank you.
Right on, thank you. Anybody have any responses to that? The question of, was
Okay, if you want me to go.
anybody, oh, okay. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, two issues were raised, and maybe now since we are talking about at Morgan, how these are, how we respond to these issues about African diaspora and the issues of identity at Morgan. How, for instance, use, again, since Tijani challenged that in terms of what is taught, in terms of my teaching and then supervision of thesis and dissertations. First and foremost, the issue of Kwanzaa, I situate it within the context of identity. And I always tell students that when we are talking about the African diaspora, about the African, we cannot separate it from identity, because identity is what defines a person. Identity is what we say we are. And then if we look at the issue of identity, and what I've tried to do is to relate a number of things in my teaching. Actually, just this semester, again, although this was actually a historiography class for the graduate class, but it came to looking at the African historiography, I wanted the students to see the Africanisms, even in the American society. Then I don't know if you are familiar with Joseph Halliday. Then I used Joseph Halliday's articles and book on Africanisms in American society. And then his study of the Gullah people in South Carolina, and how a number of the practices there are derived from Africa. And actually, a student in the class had a flash that now she understood why, when she was born as a young lady, that she was passed across the grave of her father. And that the reason for that was to remove the evil spirit or whatever spirit that, of course, will be affecting her. So just from that reading, she understood that. And then, of course, also understood all these things about food, all these various food that are eaten from the South, quote unquote, the soul food, and so many other things, how they are intimately tied to Africa. And also even how the initial Muslim slaves who were brought in, I mean, how, for instance, in terms of writing, they were given special positions and all that. So through that, there was just this eye-opening. I turned out that that was the most interesting chapter that the students were interested in, because they said they were seeing a number of things that their grandparents told them at home and what they do and what they eat that they did not understand emanate from Africa. They told them, yes, that is the point about identity. Then you also have, for instance, I supervised a thesis that looked at Oyetunji village in South Carolina, the presence of Ifa practices. Again, even in class, we discussed that. Or we discussed things like Abakwa from Cuba, which, of course, again, trying there to show how all these are products of the African experiences. Then, currently, we are talking about the issue of immigration. And for instance, a discussion that is looking at the effect of the 1965 U.S. Immigration Act and 1987 Immigration Act in terms of increasing the number of Africans who have come to the U.S., or even looking at African churches, the Redeemed Christian Church, how all these are part of Pan-Africanism. So the point really is that when we emphasize these things and then try to explain the African situation, I think in terms of, I do not know how strong, there actually was a time at Morgan when there was a strong Caribbean Students Association. And there also was a strong African Students Association. And so all those were sources of engagement and all that. So there are various teachings here that emphasize those aspects of African diaspora that also demonstrate to students the connectedness between every person on campus.
Right on. Kwame Ture said, right? The job of the conscious is to make the unconscious conscious of their unconscious behavior. Dr. Brewer, any follow-ups or responses to
Maybe I'd like to get back to the first question about, again, discrimination between within African, whether it's in diaspora or within Africa. I think it's very important to understand that we have an important role here at Morgan State University. Historically, we started 100 years before civil rights law, Title IX and, civil rights 1964 and equal pay. So we kind of have retroactively written the law. So we have huge responsibility to make sure that we are actually following that law that came at least 100 years from now. We're talking about the Pan-Africanism today, but the foundations of Pan-Africanism is anti-racist. It's like you have to be anti-racist, you have to be anti-corruption and fraud, and that the slavery that happened, that millions of people who were taken out of Africa went to Europe and America, and they were denied voting rights, and they were segregated, denied education. So the tenet of Pan-Africanism, we still need to stick with those, and we need to emphasize those very firmly at Morgan State University as an academic institution. And we need to apply those foundations not only for African. So we have two jobs: eliminate the differences or those discriminatory practices, educate our students, our faculty and staff about those in terms of like looking at Africans from one perspective, if you are talking about Pan-Africanism. And the second layer is to look at the human being in general. We have federal law that we need to follow up very strictly when it comes to dealing with human beings in general, regardless of who you are, where you were born, inside or outside Africa, whether you're even African or not. So I think as an educational institution, we have huge burdens, specifically that, again, we have written the law 100 years before it even comes. So we need to do lots of efforts towards that to educate our community to start with, and then I think it will spread outside.
I think I could add that a great pedagogical tool is study abroad, actually, and that as we develop it, and I know it's expensive, and it's a question of access. I guess figuring out ways to increase the support for that is important, and as it's developed, I guess we want to see there are ways to integrate to make it seamless what students learn in the class as like preparation for, say, for example, 6 weeks or whatever other time, in a particular place, right? So we could have people, I've been starting to develop something around the history of carnival and the sort of street theater arts, which is an interesting aspect of diaspora culture throughout the Americas, in Brazil, throughout the Caribbean, Trinidad, and then here in the United States as well, New Orleans. And then you have these new carnivals of the new diasporas, Caribbean diasporas in New York and Toronto and London, right? So you've got this broad, sort of cultural artifact that's developing, emerging, this practice that's emerging, and how great it would be for our students to actually spend time in a Salvador Bahia or in Port of Spain, Trinidad, observing, this process, having learned something about it before then going there, before this kind of process took place. But I'm just sort of talk about, think about ways where the pedagogy can reflect this sort of integration.
I think that's a great idea, and I really appreciate the comment and question, because as a self-criticism, I think over the years I've fallen into the trap of, in terms of how I engage Kwanzaa with my students, I've fallen personally too much into the trap of being overly focused on its founder than its potential to be a benefit. So I have to double check that on myself, so I appreciate that. I'm not entirely sure what we're supposed to do with time. I know some of us have 1 o'clock classes, so I suspect that there's some concern there. But if there are any other comments, and Dean and Gome, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add in response or closing. But if not, oh yes, please go ahead. Yes.
That's my daughter.
I'm as proud of her you should be.
That's a strong question.
Hello, thank you so much for this panel today. I have a quick question. Professor Dubois noted how there was sort of this desire amongst Africans to figure out what their identity was. And so I think in discussions about the diaspora and Pan-Africanism, I think it's important to figure out why we're having these discussions to begin with. And so I think there's sort of 3 categories here. Is this like an intrinsic human desire to figure out what my identity is? Sort of Immanuel Kant talked about the inner and the outer self. Is this sort of the second category, which is a desire to figure out how I present to other people, which you mentioned W.E. Du Bois talked about extensively with double consciousness, even Hegelian mutual recognition, things like that, so how I present to others? Or is it sort of this third category where we see sort of the entirety of Africa has been, to some extent, marginalized and oppressed by Western society, and so there's this school of thought that perhaps the reason why Africans tend to have these sort of identity crises about where they belong is due to sort of Orientalism and Western ideas about what Africans should and shouldn't be. This is sort of prevalent and was previously said with about like the census, sort of this conception that African Americans must be Black, which is part of the reason why I struggle to fill out what I am on the form, having been born in Africa, but not having been a darker color. So sort of these, why do you think these identity crises sort of are prevalent in African communities when they don't necessarily seem as prevalent in, for example, groups of white folks or Eurocentric identities? And is it sort of this internal desire? Is it this desire to figure out how we present externally, or is it possibly implicated by Westernization and how the West has sort of changed the way that Africans view themselves and view themselves to others? So loaded question, and I know we're short on time, but would appreciate some further
Easily
insights.
handled in 60 to 90 seconds, I'm sure. I mean, that's not a problem. Seriously, does anybody want to at least attempt?
I think I share the same question since I'm her mother. So.
I think I would love there to be a teaser for season 2 and the Pan-African panel part 2. But anybody want to take any response to that?
Well, I think, well, if just for a brief answer, I think a brief response to that will actually be the influence of Europeans. I mean, what Africans have experienced. Again, Europe essentially even defined what Africa is. If you even watch Ali Mazri's video, the triple Africa, the triple heritage, his argument is, who says that Saudi Arabia, for instance, is not part of Africa? That's actually Europeans who geographically identified what Africa is. Those same Westerners, when they came, actually also created divisions even among African groups, and so created that whole racialization. And so these are products of those Western identity, Eurocentric something, and it was deliberate, because you actually have to devalue a people's identity. You have to make a people to lose faith in themselves for you to be able to exploit them and dominate them. And that's why, like I said, I always emphasize issues of identity as an important source of empowerment. Because once you are confident in your identity, and once you do not allow any other person to define your identity for you, then that is the beginning of empowering yourself.
Slaves and dogs are named by their masters. Free women and men name themselves, as Richard Moore once said. Anybody else? Cecilia, any final thoughts? Uh-oh.
I want to comment on the question about facing resistance, what they see between them and the African Americans in the States, right? Yeah.
Moment. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. I don't have a response that I thought you were about to get into. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I was going to comment on that. Like I said earlier about the tortured becoming the torturer. He's saying that the first, resistance between them and the African American in the States, right? Just like the professor said earlier, it's all about this identity stuff, which I'm sure, and I believe that this one tribe, that's been instituted by the Office of Global and Cross-Cultural Programming is going to be a bridge to that. It's going to try and bridge that gap, because you can't say you want to be one when you are not acting it. You find in a situation, because I've seen that happen. You find the situation whereby when African Americans see Africans as less, right? Because they happen to be in the States, and when Africans come over there, they try to segregate. That's one of the discrepancies that's always gonna mark this advocacy, really. But one thing I'm sure, and I praise this advocacy for, is because even in my teaching, in my classes, I found out that this movement actually is even having great effect on those that are not even African. I see professors when they want to share classes or share groups, they make sure that they interchange it, that people from all Asia and the Middle East are being mixed up with Africans. Yeah, because I believe that they're having those feelings. They are getting that feeling. They support, even though they're not part of it, but they support this movement, right? What we're trying to do is to promote this unity among Africans, be it diaspora or not. It's a good thing, and it's having effect in the larger society. If only we can solve our problem, within ourselves. Trying to make sure whether you're in the Middle East, whether you're in America, whether anywhere you find yourself, be able to identify where you come from, identify who you really are. It will help us because it is our problem, our internal problem that is actually, not, making us not to get anywhere in this issue. So I would like an MSU, right, programs that can actually bring us together, integrate us, especially African Americans with Africans, so that we can try as much as possible to air our views, to be able to say, this is, who we are, this is where we're coming from, this is, we're here for one goal, we want to achieve unity. Because we contribute so much, wherever we find ourselves, we need to be together. So we try to solve such discrepancies by creating, a lot of activities that could actually make us see that we are just humans, no matter what it is. I wouldn't want to see Africans, being the torturer at this time. That would be fair. Even at this 21st century, that would be right at all. For us to be able to promote what our parents, our ancestors have done for us, we need to make sure that we reduce the opportunity that create the discrepancies among ourselves. Thank you.
See, appreciate that. Listen, thank you, everybody. I want to just thank everybody for participating. Thanks to Dean and Gome. Thanks to my colleagues. And a big shout out not only to Dr. Johnson and Ciron Greenidge, but to the good brothers and sisters of the Digital Media Center. Appreciate all of you very much. And for all of you virtually who are here, we appreciate you. And as Fred Hampton used to say to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody. We'll catch you at the next one. Take care, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have to get this.
Thank you, Ms. Cecilia.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Gerard.